So we're now going to hear from Miriam Kivlehan. She's from Ireland. Miriam's going to give us a background on the Irish context for people who haven't found out or heard about what's going on in Ireland, and then give us a bit of a focus on the current review of the Equality Acts, which the Irish government recently put out to public consultation. So welcome, Miriam, and over to you.
Okay, so I'll talk kind of a little bit about the background, first of all, and just to look at a timeline, I suppose, of the whole gender recognition in Ireland. And Ireland is very often, I suppose, referenced because we seem to have been a forerunner for the self-ID. And so that the timeline for that was that initially it was the result of a High Court order in a landmark case called the Dr. Lydia Foy case, which compelled the Irish state to do something with regard to recognising the legal status of Lydia, who has a sex reassignment operation in the UK at the time and wanted legal recognition as a woman. So that's what sort of prompted it. In 2010, the government set up the Gender Recognition Advisory Group, and it was charged with putting together a report and making the recommendations. And in 2011, that report was published, fairly extensive and very detailed report, and essentially it was recommending a medical pathway. So quite a conservative approach to gender recognition, over 18s only, and through a medical pathway which required some sort of a medical certification from a practitioner. That wasn't well received amongst those who were advocating for a self-ID pathway at the time. So around about 2013, there were two bills for self-ID, which were both tabled in the Parliament by opposition. One was in the lower house and one in the upper house. Now, neither of those got past the first stage, but they were the first indications of a completely different proposal, which looked at no gatekeeping whatsoever, self-determination. So both of those bills were in 2013. In 2014, the Gender Recognition Bill, which was the outworking of the 2011 report, came forward from the Department of Social Protection, was the lead department in government at the time. Now, Social Protection, for those who might not be aware, is sort of the social welfare department in Ireland. And it came forward with the Gender Recognition Bill 2014. And essentially, again, it was built on the 2011 report, nearly almost an entirely medical pathway. Following the next stage in the timeline, and I'll go back and talk about a couple of these things because they are important in terms of sequencing. 2015 then was very much taken up, I suppose, in Ireland with the marriage equality referendum, and because it was a constitutional bar to being able to legislate for marriage equality, that required a public referendum. So that was a very high profile and very front-facing campaign. And it happens that in 2015, the Gender Recognition Act was amended and eventually brought into law. So those two things happened, and one was very high profile and the other was sort of masked behind that. And I think those who are familiar with the Denton's playbook, as it were, will see that reference in that as to how it's a recommended tactic, in fact, if you can sort of put a campaign behind another more high profile one. 2018, again, we had a public referendum on abortion rights, and that had been a long campaign going back from 2012 that culminated in a referendum in 2018. And legislation for abortion in 2019. So what's the connection between some of those? Well, this was the bill that was introduced in 2014, which eventually became law, and it was initiated in December 2014. And you can see here that an extract from that, the section G on the bottom, requires a certificate in writing of a medical practitioner certifying, and it shows the various requirements that must be forthcoming in order for a certificate to be eligible. That was at the first stage. At the next stage, in January and February 2015, that requirement is still there. So it's gone through a few stages in the Oireachtas, in the Houses of Parliament. It has been deliberated on. Now, if you look at the debates online, you'll see there were actually very little debate and very few even public representatives engaging in the discussion, but nevertheless, it went through a few stages, and you still see that Section G is still there. And it wasn't until then they set up, there was a committee to look at some of the lobby groups who were looking for the removal of that. So they set up a select committee, and it was at that point that Section G was removed in its entirety. And if you look at that in terms of the timeline, that was quite advanced and well into the whole process. And by July, that whole entire section had been removed from it. Now, anyone who's interested in that whole process can find it at that website domain there. You will actually find the whole timeline of the bill from its initiation to the end and all of the debates. So I suppose what I'm saying is that if you go back to the 2007 test case that set the conditions for this, even members of the public who would have been publicly following this, or who would have had an interest or a side interest, would have been following a particular story. And it was only in that last month that story changed as to what that legislation would look like. And it was during that period of time, as I say, when the marriage equality campaign was in its height, that these other deliberations were coming forward. So what was the response? Well, it really, I suppose, the legislation went relatively unnoticed by most people, as I say, in that background, until around about 2017, when women began to find that it was colliding with some of the stuff that was emerging in the abortion rights campaign and the repeal of the Eighth Amendment. It was in full swing. And that was I suppose the first time that women began to realise that there may be an implication, because there was questions about the language that was going to be used in any subsequent legislation. But anybody who's even interested in looking to see how present the whole discussion was, if you do a confined Google search during that period, June 2014 to June 2015, you'll see the absence of any public debate or commentary on the Gender Recognition Bill or the Gender Recognition Act. So the abortion rights campaign, which is, say, really in its latter time had become a national campaign between 2015 and 2018. That stage, there was an infrastructure around about the country. It was a very as most of them are in most jurisdictions. They're very hostile campaigns and very weary and very long. And anyway, it did end up in success in Ireland because it was a popular vote that the constitution was changed. Again, there was a constitutional bar, it couldn't be legislated for without that. So you can just, given you from that image there, you can kind of see the two binary positions there. It was yes, no. However, it did pass, which created removed the constitutional bar to being able to legislate for abortion. And it was around about that time that the heads of bill and talking about what the legislation might look like came into public domain. And it was around about that time that then all of a sudden the language began to be contested as to what language would be used in the abortion legislation. And certain advocates were coming forward and wanted to remove references to women or female and replace it with pregnant people. So that, I think, for many women who wouldn't have been following the gender recognition story for numbers of years for any reason, it might have been sort of, I suppose, marginal to their particular mainstream interests, suddenly found themselves very much aware of what was going on. And again, it was mostly on what happened was, I suppose, a kind of visceral reaction by a lot of women who were kind of very defensive and said, what do you mean there's not going to be women in the abortion legislation? Of course there's going to be women in it. That's what we legislated for. That's what we campaigned for. So to a certain extent, the backlash on social media and in some of those online forums like Mumsnet created a sort of spaces where women ended up, well, some of them, I suppose, there were some women who were vocal about it were put on block lists. So these block lists became like these gulags, became places where women met and realized that there was a whole conversation that needed to be had. And I suppose out of that, a certain amount of the issue began to be, so a certain amount of organizing, for want of a better word, around people who were using the term gender critical and arose. So where are we now, or where we are now, is that in Ireland, there are about 6 different groupings of women that would have spawned out of that background. And I know there's a lot of talk even in WHRC about organising, and I suppose from looking back in Ireland over the last couple of years, what I would say is that I think the key thing here is organising and not having a focus on organisation, and it's not getting too hung up on the noun and thinking about the verb, because I think going back in those early stages, there were a very small number of women who were coming together and who were having conversations and wanting to see what could be done. And a lot of energy was put in at the very beginning in trying to hold consensus amongst a small group of people. And it became apparent that women came from very different backgrounds. Some of them had a feminist background, some of them didn't. Some of them didn't care to, and they didn't really want to know about having to sort of do all of that work. They wanted to get into this. So whilst it can seem threatening for a grouping to split and go separate ways, in actual fact, it can be quite advantageous because they cluster and work together. So there are now kind of, I suppose, 6 groupings. One of them is called Radicalini, which borrows its name from the Irish for Colleen, which is a girl, and radical. So that's one of the groups. Now, it doesn't have a very public front-facing figure because a lot of the women actually who are behind that have various reasons to keep their own identity preserved. And there are a couple of migrant women who were involved in that, and they do work with migrants as well, both voluntarily, and they would have concerns about protecting the work they're doing. So they don't have a very public front-facing person, but they've been doing a lot of work in the last year and a lot of campaigning and lobbying and organising around submissions to public consultations and that sort of thing. Women's Space Ireland is a small grouping, and it's focused on, actually what I'll do is, they're just the thumbs, I'll take you through each one. So Radicalini describe themselves more as from a radical feminist perspective, and that's just as a grab from their website, which kind of shows where their areas of focus are. So they have a broad and a wider lens, and they are interested in rooting themselves in the idea of radical feminism. You can see Twitter handles and websites there as references for anybody who wants to go and find them. The next one is the Countess. I know Leisha has been on here before, so some of you may be familiar with the Countess. And I suppose they came together more around about that conversation and that hook that people would use to call themselves gender critical. So again, not having to confine themselves to any particular school or ideology of feminism and just get stuck in. So that's a grab from their website, which kind of sets out where their focus is really on this particular conversation around about sex and gender and single sex spaces for women. And their references are there. The LGB Alliance started up last year and immediately found itself in all sorts of flurries. There was a very, very hostile and visceral backlash very quickly against the LGB Alliance Ireland. That's Kerry Black there, who is one of the front-facing members of it and has become more and became targeted very quickly. The reaction was very visceral. There was articles written in the newspaper classifying them as hate groups, and a number of organisations actually came together and co-signed a public open letter with regard to proposing to have them legitimised. At the moment, Kerry is in the middle of a storm as well. She's living in the north with her wife and her young children. And again, following on a complaint made by a man on Twitter, she's been investigated by the PSNI on one of these charges of what is it? It's not online harassment, but one of those charges. I can't remember what the technical term for it is. So she's in the middle of that at the moment. It's one of those situations where they invited her in for a caution and she politely declined. So they've now kind of told her to be, ready to be arrested, to come in and answer for those charges. The Irish Women's Lobby, then, that's just a quick grab. I actually couldn't grab from their website because it's one of those that you can't take a screenshot. So they said to shape a future in which women and girls can live free from imposed gender roles and expect to be protected from male violence. They have a couple of front-facing members, and Rachel Moran would have been very active prior to this in work around prostitution and campaigning for the Nordic model in Ireland. So some of their members would have maybe a radical feminist background, and some coming in from the more recent contemporary gender critical description. And then Women's Space Ireland is a very small collective of a number of women. They are both, yes, they're both I think they're both named. I'm not sure if both of them are, so I won't mention a name. One of them is a journalist and the other is a writer, and fairly well known. So what they've used their space for really is more, they gather information. They've created a kind of a repository where information can be put. They spend a lot of time doing FOI requests and gathering data and placing it in one single place so that other groups or people who want technical information can find it. And then in the north, there is a group of women who are based in Belfast. They're based in Belfast, but they have members from across the 6 counties. So it's the Women's Right Network Northern Ireland, and they don't have a website, but there are Facebook pages there, and they are on Twitter. And again, because the jurisdiction there, the legal jurisdiction there is different, they have a different set of challenges or different timelines that they're working off, and it differs as well from in England or even in Scotland and Wales. So recently, leading up, I suppose, to the current work that's been done. So whilst they're all quite different and they all have their own spaces, they do come together collaboratively. And that's a shot just taken a couple of weeks ago outside the Parliament building. So all of the 6 of them, or sorry, the 6 groups came together with their front-facing people. So it wasn't a boots on the ground or, feet on the street type of campaign. They simply wanted to come together in a collegial way around with a common message, which was a lead-in, really, I suppose, to encouraging people to engage with the review that was underway on the equality legislation. So that's actually a mix of numbers of reps from the different 6 groups who came together, those who could be seen in public. And even that itself did provoke a certain amount of backlash on Twitter. And there is a YouTube video, of that event, or of their speeches outside the Parliament, so you can find it at that URL there. So what's happening now at the moment is a review and a proposed review and amendment of the Irish equality legislation. So this has been commissioned by the Department of Children, Disability, Equality, Integration and Youth, which is a very long-winded name for a government department, but it's within that ministry that the responsibility for equality legislation rests for the main part, even though it's quite a broad suite of legislation and crosses over into other departments as well. So they had a review, and closing date was last week. So primarily what they wanted to look was at reviewing the Equal Status Act 2000-2018 and the various Employment Equality Acts. So again, there's a lot of equality legislation that is a part of other legislation, not something that was written as a standalone piece. And to review and one of the things that's stated is they wanted to look at the economic ground for discrimination and the amendment of the gender ground. Now, there's no explanation as to why they wanted to do an amendment of the gender ground. It's simply in there as part of the terms of reference. That's the suite of legislation entirely that's been reviewed in this one single review. So it's quite broad, and obviously there are parts that would impact on other people outside of women, other protected categories of people, but it's just to get an idea of what the list is. The approach I think that a lot of people have taken, I had a quick look at the websites because the closing date was last week, and I see some of them have their submissions up on their websites, and I think they've probably got quite a lot of individual women to make submissions as well. And the thrust of it seems to be that the ask from a lot of the groups is to have sex added as a protected characteristic, because we have one single protected characteristic in the Equal Status Act is gender, but in some of the others it's sex. So you have the conflation across numbers of different pieces of legislation. So the ask seems to be from most of the groups to ask for the addition of sex as a protected characteristic, as opposed to getting into competing as to what gender should be interpreted as, and saying that there should be sex and gender. So it will be interesting to see what the outcome of the review of that will be, or what the quality of the submissions will be like. But that's kind of what's happening on the Irish front.